There was a time when Calradia was a land dominated by forests and wild animals. Tribes of hunter-gatherers migrated between the valleys and travelled along the rivers in search of food, building temporary settlements and worshipping ancient gods. Among these many forgotten tribes, one stood out due to its unusual organisation for that time. The chiefs of the Batanian clans answered to a High King, a noble title used by the tribe's sovereign since time immemorial. Very little is known about the origins of the lineage of the Batanian High Kings. It is only known that long before the first kingdoms and castles appeared in Calradia, the Batanians already ruled their own country. The coronation of the High King took place pompously on a sacred hill called Dunac, a ceremony of great political and religious importance. The exact location of the Dunac Hill remains a mystery. Although all Batanians affirmed its existence, no outsider has ever visited the place. It is reasonable to consider that, due to the importance of the sacred hill, the Batanians kept its location a secret to protect their sacred customs, maintain security during future coronations, or even preserve treasures and important relics for the history of their culture. The coronation rituals of the High King were conducted in the city of Dunglanis, near the Glennis rock, making this massive cliff the closest possible location to Dunac. Considering that the rock stands watchful over Lake Lin Tywal, whose waters have always been a significant source of sustenance for the Batanians. At some point, before any other people did the same in Calradia, the Batanians gradually moved away from nomadic life and built villages to cultivate food and raise livestock, serving as an example for neighbouring tribes. In ancient times, the Batanians lived in small settlements that stretched from the southern forests of Calradia to the icy mountains of the north. At their maximum extent, they populated the banks of the river Thrand from its source to Cape Fal, mainly focusing on the Ucelian Plateau, as well as all the forests of the wildlands of Irkara and the rocky Varcheg Bay to the north. Farmers and fishermen populated all the shores of Lake Lin Tywal, right in the middle of the Ucelian Plateau, making this place the heart of Batanian culture. The dark waters of the deep lake were not only crucial for the growth of Batanian society, but also held immense importance in local folklore. The lands around the village of Remtoil were the most fertile on the entire plateau, providing a lot of grain for the region. It is believed that in this ancestral time, the Batanians already lived in Pen Cannock, near the Thrand River, collecting clay to make pottery. Local legends spoke of fishermen who disappeared in the river, lured by nymphs, who would lead them into deep waters until they drowned. The Batanian chiefs considered all the pastures and forests surrounding their hall as their possession, as far as the eye could see. In the early days of Battania, it's possible that the High King was mostly a religious figure, created to prevent conflicts among clan chiefs and mediate disputes. Batanian mythology speaks of the other world, a dark place where the spirits of the dead went. It is believed that one of the entrances to this place is at the bottom of Lake Lin Tywal. In the city of Sianon near the lake, there was a local legend about Algana, a young Batanian woman who tragically lost her husband Gorowan. Her sorrow was so great that the guardian spirits of the lake allowed Gorowan to return to Algana for a single day and night, and so he did, emerging from the waters of the lake. The story of Algana and Gorowan is a depiction of the Batanian mysticism that has always surrounded Lake Lin Tywal. Considering that they were mostly a forest people, it's not surprising that they enveloped so much mystery and magical creatures regarding lakes, rivers and seas. The lumber mills in the village of Torlead are an example of how much the Batanians cared about protecting their lands, rivers, and especially trees. For centuries, they carefully extracted wood from the forests of Torlead, always allowing it to regenerate and keeping the fauna intact. Whether out of fear of retaliation from spirits or simply environmental awareness, the Batanians knew that their greatest shield against invading forces was always the nature itself. There are few records indicating bloodshed among the Batanians, although they did indeed have their own disagreements. Given that oral tradition was the primary tool for educating Batanian culture, many stories were told solely through music crafted by forest bards and echoed through generations. For centuries, the Batanians lived in the misty hills of Calradia, and no other people adapted to life in the dense forests as well as they did. Given the expanse that the Batanians populated in Calradia, it's possible that in ancient times they had friendly interactions and even conflicts with other civilizations. To the north, extremely hostile wild tribes lived among the Cherti Mountains, while to the south, semi-nomadic farmers, the Palaic and Ialoi people, were more open to trade and friendly relations. The dense forests of Calradia posed many challenges for travellers on pack horses, which required special care. When the Batanians weren't travelling on foot, they preferred to use the smaller relatives of horses, ponies. In the village of Glintor, pony breeders worked on crossbreeding their animals over decades to create the Glintor pony, an extremely efficient pony breed for travelling through forests, which became widely used throughout Battania. From the beginning, it's known that the Batanians faced various incursions by northern seafarers in the Varcheg Bay, who came from distant lands to raid and pillage their peaceful villages. Considering the vast territory in which the Batanians lived, surrounded by wild forests, unknown tribes and sea invaders, they developed an efficient yet controversial tradition for warrior training, the Code of the Wolf. The Code of the Wolf was a series of guidelines created for young Batanians to learn how to survive in the Calradia forests, learning hunting, fishing, gathering, tracking, fighting, killing, and living in the wild without a home or family, without even wearing clothes or cooking their food. Many children of Batanian nobility underwent the Code of the Wolf during their youth to become great warriors and defend their clans. Although they perfected survival in the Calradian forests and rivers, there was a High King of Battania named Mon, who sought to explore the northern seas, from where invaders frequently came to terrorize the shores of the Varcheg Bay. High King Mon, known for his skill in combat, assembled a crew of capable men and set sail to the north, disappearing forever. While not much information remains about Mon's reign, it's believed that he was a great defender of Battania against outsiders. In the city of Carbanzath, centuries later, rumours still circulated that High King Mon might return from distant lands to save Battania from its enemies. Around 900 years before the Empire, the Batanians already had a vast trade network circulating through most of the continent, carrying raw materials on ponies and mainly trading with their closest southern neighbours, the Ialoi. Despite frequently dealing with external invaders, Batanians could also be quite inconvenient when they wanted to be. Using their forest knowledge, they developed highly effective tactics for nocturnal attacks. Although not militarily aggressive or expansionist, throughout their history, Battania naturally adapted to a proto-feudal class system. The High King, perhaps the oldest noble title, always stood at the top of the Batanian social pyramid. This position was occupied by figures who demonstrated leadership, warrior spirit, and vowed to protect forest traditions. The Batanian clans had jurisdiction to rule their own lands, villages, and demand tributes from peasants. Clan chiefs called mormares directly answered the High King's orders, especially in times of crisis, where mormares commanded military detachments like generals. In times of peace, mormares governed Battania's villages, protected crops, livestock, and defended their lands against raiders and bandits. The mormares were surrounded by trusted advisors and assistants, nobles who held the title of Toisek, members of the wealthiest families within a clan. Toiseks typically acquired their title by purchasing it with money or donating land and cattle to a mormare. They acted as village lieutenants and assisted the mormares in leading Batanian soldiers. The title of Toisek, while not explicitly stated, was reserved exclusively for the children and close relatives of a mormare or another Toisek. A professional soldier of Battania, considered experienced and skilled, was granted the title of Fian, whether for their agility with a sword or precision with a bow. They consisted of highly efficient veteran combat soldiers. The Toisech could be considered a noble-born Fian who, to differentiate themselves from peasant warriors, adopted a distinct title and enjoyed certain privileges. The lowest social stratum among the Batanians consisted of peasants, mostly hunters and farmers. They lived in modest houses within the settlements of the mormares or in cabins in the forest where they could find a bit more freedom and isolation. At least 750 years before the Empire, the Batanians gradually received news from the south. Conflicts between neighbouring tribes were escalating, and everyone spoke with fear of a name, Calradios. In the southern part of the continent, a wealthy and organised tribe living along the shores of the Gulf of Charas began a series of expansions and incursions against their neighbours, growing in size and seizing lands. They were led by Calradios the Great, a disciplined and ambitious general who in just a few years expanded his domains in a way no other tribe had done before. He assimilated small nomadic clans and subjugated various city-states. Calradios was such an emblematic and important figure that his subjects came to be known as the Calradoi, the inhabitants of Calradia, the name by which the entire continent would formerly be known in the centuries to come. In its early years, the relationship between the Calradoi and Battania is unknown. Calradios had founded a great city in the south and had caused a significant stir in the region. But until that moment, the Batanian lands remained untouched by the conflicts in the south. The first real threat to the Batanians emerged gradually, around 600 years before the Empire, when the first migrants came from the north to settle in Calradia. Beyond the sea to the north, where the frozen continent of Yumna lies, Nordic sailors constantly attacked and plundered Batanian villages in the Varcheg Bay and on the Ebor Peninsula. However, seeking a better and less harsh life than the snow-covered lands of Yumna, some Nordic tribes decided to sail not for plunder and killing, but with the intent to colonize those lands and never return to Yumna. The first migrant ships arrived led by a warlord known as Horsa, a great warrior who, upon arriving in Calradia, planted his spear in the sand of the first beach he set foot on and founded the first colony on the Ebor Peninsula. In the years that followed, more and more ships arrived, carrying settlers and warriors who soon clashed with the Batanians. With immense ferocity, they colonized the entire Ebor Peninsula and Cape Fal. In a matter of decades, the northern migrant tribes, travelling by sea, had spread along the banks of the River Thrand, and even into the Biscan Hills to the south. The repeated battles and skirmishes against the Batanians demonstrated the migrants' desire to populate that land. They killed and drove away the Batanian chiefs and settled there, forcing them to retreat to the interior of the Uchalion Plateau. Around 500 years before the Empire, these Nordic tribes had already spread across much of the eastern lands of Calradia. For the first time, the Batanians tasted the bitter taste of defeat. They saw part of their lands devastated and filled with strangers, speaking an incomprehensible language and willing to kill anyone who opposed the occupation of that territory. It is undeniable that the arrival of the Nordic migrants showed the High King of Battania and its clan chiefs the need to evolve politically and become more united as a single tribe. One of the stories sung by Batanian bards tells of a Batanian queen who reigned in the year 400 before the Empire, and over her years as queen married 5 different men, consequently declared kings of Battania. Her name was Glennis. The story of Glennis is shrouded in mysteries and many theories, but little is known about who she really was, except that she chose her husbands very carefully, one after the death of the other. It is not known if Glennis was a tyrant, an assassin, or a benefactor. However, a prophecy declared that she would have 7 children, and all 7 would be killed by the same man, ensuring that none of her offspring could inherit the Batanian throne. It is understandable to believe that Glennis's 7 children were not good people. They grew up as warriors and were influenced by the prophecy received by their mother from the moment they were born. It is possible that the fear and paranoia surrounding the 7 siblings made them dangerous individuals in adulthood. The legacy of Queen Glennis remained present throughout the history of Battania. Thanks to the 5 coronations of her husbands, she directly influenced the rituals involving the reigns of her people. The city of Dunglanis became the capital of Battania, named in honour of the queen. In the Batanian language, Dunglanis means Rock of Glennis, which is also the name of the cliff where the city is located, near Lake Lin Tywal. History tells that eventually a hero named Oclagan challenged Glennis' sons to spare the Batanians from the paranoia that surrounded their family. One by one, Oclagan duelled and killed all 7 of Glennis' sons. It is said that in the 7th duel, Oclagan and the last son of Glennis faced off at a river ford. Oclagan cut the throat of his opponent's horse just before defeating him, gaining a significant advantage over his enemy. The horse's blood flowed into the water, turning the river red as the two duelled. In the end, Oclagan emerged victorious and fulfilled the prophecy. Near his place of victory, Oclagan built his own house, giving rise to a village that would eventually become Marunath, the future capital of Battania. In Batanian, Marunath means horse of the ford, an allusion to the prophecy that had been fulfilled there. The story told by the bards does not mention whether Oclagan took the Batanian crown for himself after the death of all the tyrannical heirs, or allowed some ancient lineage predating Queen Glennis to return to power. The fate of Oclagan after winning the duels is another mystery of Batanian history, lost forever in time. Although not all High Kings had ruled Battania from Marunath, the city gradually became larger and more important than the old Dunglanis. In the centuries that followed, the Batanians witnessed some significant events in their surroundings. Their old enemies, the Nordic migrants, had now organized themselves into a confederation of tribes and were known in the region as Proto-Swadians. Although they did not form a kingdom or empire, these Proto-Swadians unanimously recognized Battania's authority in the lands to the east of the Rhodok Hills, marking a natural border between the two peoples. While the Batanian city of Lin Modris was west of the Rhodok Hills, the entire Oxbool Lake area still remained under Batanian control. Further to the south, the Calradian were engaged in a complex political game, waging wars against neighbouring tribes. Several centuries ago, their political structure had shifted from a monarchy following the lineage of Calradios the Great to become a republic governed by a corrupt senate. Until then, the relations between the Calradian Republic and the Batanians had remained neutral ever since the Calradian became prominent in the Periassic Sea region. However, due to the Republic's increasing expansions and westward incursions, it became clear to the Batanians that a major conflict was on the horizon. Many tribes neighbouring Battania, such as the Palaics, Ioloics, Massa, Laconians and Rhotians, one by one, disappeared under the banners of the Calradian Republic. 12 years before the Empire, a series of violent conflicts interspersed with brief periods of peace began. The Batanian Wars. The Batanian Wars featured the bloodiest and most brutal battles in the continent's history. Many lives were lost, and their outcome would forever change life in Calradia. Before the first legions of the Empire arrived on the Uchelian Plateau, it is important to note that the High Kings of Battania were already accustomed to foreign forces seeking to seize their wealth. At least 1,000 years before the Empire, the Batanians had already experienced conflicts with the Vakan and Vani peoples, their neighbours who inhabited the Chertig Mountains to the northeast of Battania. Centuries before the Batanian Wars, the Proto-Swadian tribes had massacred and decimated Batanian settlements at the western edge of the continent. This event may have alerted the future High Kings of Battania to the need to improve their organisation as a nation and professional armies. Many conflicts between the Calradians and Batanians took place during that time. They were mostly incursions by the Republic into the Cafalcombe Valley, an important region that provided access to the Uchelian Plateau and Lake Lin Tywal. Time and time again, Republic troops were decimated and unable to defeat the Batanian archers fighting within their forests. Such was the bloodshed that the entire Calradian military force was left crippled after 2 years of conflict. After a major defeat in Cafalcombe, the Batanians saw an opportunity to counterattack, and they did just that. Batanian troops surrounded the imperial seaside city of Charas and seized supplies from Calradian villages in the vicinity. The port of Charas was of utmost importance to the Republic's economy, so if it were destroyed or occupied by the Batanians, it could spell the end of the Calradian nation. In a decision driven by panic, the Republic's Senate decided to create the title of Emperor for their most experienced senator. This title granted supreme command over the Calradian armed forces, as well as emergency powers over the entire government. The chosen senator was the one with the greatest military experience and determination, Cineas Kaiser. Kaiser was not chosen arbitrarily. Not only was he a talented general, but he had studied the Batanians relentlessly throughout the wars of the past years. He quickly prevented the city of Charas from falling into enemy hands and exploited all the weaknesses of the Batanians, targeting their most vulnerable points and making extensive use of cavalry against them. In the 4 years following the failed siege of Charas, Cineas Caesar led the Republic's armies efficiently, driving the Batanians out of Calradian territory and taking control of Oakspool Lake, annexing the city of Lin Modris, the last Batanian settlement west of the Rhodok Hills. The ancient city of Lin Modris became unrecognizable and renamed Occupies Hall. Caesar was hailed as a hero among his people, proclaimed the saviour of Calradia, and granted powers that exceeded the limits of legality for the position of emperor. The Cafalcombe Valley still remained guarded by the Batanians. Patrols of specialized archers called Fian still roamed the forests, where many Calradian bodies had fallen. However, to the west, the Batanians had been pushed into the interior of the plateau, and Oakspool Lake was now under control of the Calradian lords, never receiving Batanian fishing boats again. Lin Modris was a great Batanian city that benefited from the riches of the lake and the fertility of the surrounding land. It resisted all attempts at invasion by the Nordic migrants and offered security for the Batanians living west of the Rhodok Hills for centuries. The city on Oakspool Lake was the first victim of the true extermination of the Batanians. Those who did not flee and chose to defend themselves against the Calradian siege were massacred once the enemy troops breached the gates and walls. Lin Modris was plundered, its wooden walls suffered irreversible damage, Batanian temples were destroyed, and many houses were set on fire. The population was exterminated, and Calradian builders quickly volunteered to rebuild the site on their own way. The Batanians found themselves disorganized, with dwindling numbers and unable to withstand a new Calradian incursion. Nevertheless, a major civil war erupted among the Calradian aristocracy, putting an end to the Batanian Wars, as both sides found themselves unable to launch further offensives. The Batanians had been bold and confident, venturing beyond their valleys and forests, a decision that cost them a significant portion of their lands. However, the sense of revenge still lingered, and the High King chose to accept the end of the war in order to regroup. These events solidified the enduring rivalry between Battania and the Calradoi. In the 6 years following the end of the wars, the Calradian Republic found itself embroiled in a civil war over control of the government. On one side, Cineas Caesar, the emperor, used his newly acquired renown and provisional title to take control of the nation, while the Senate, discontented with the emperor's ambitions, organized resistance against his advances. The Calradoi civil war was rife with assassinations, skirmishes, and urban conflicts. Both the Senate and the emperor had barely recovered from the recent Batanian Wars, so neighbouring tribes, such as the Proto-Swadian and Massa peoples, occasionally entered Calradian lands to raid villages and steal cattle. Recognizing the vulnerable state of his government, Caesar decided to hire a large mercenary army from distant lands. Not far from Calradia, across the Western Ocean, lies the Kingdom of Battania, which covers the entire expanse of a warlike island. Balian soldiers were accustomed to trading through sea routes with the city of Charas, and Caesar was aware of the military services offered by the Balian crown. In order to quell the Senate's resistance and consolidate his power in Calradia, the emperor brought the Balian mercenaries to the continent, altering the course of the war and ultimately founding the legendary Calradian Empire. In the first century of the empire's existence, the Calradians focused on expanding their dominions to the south and beyond the Western Sea. At some point, a new war broke out between Battania and the newly formed Calradian Empire. The city of Pencannock fell quickly, as did the entire Upper Thrand region and parts of the Rhodok Hills. It is not known how long Pencannock remained occupied, but eventually the Batanians recaptured it and drove the Imperials from their lands, leading to a stalemate that ended in a truce. Around 250 years after the formation of the empire, a new wave of Proto-Swadian barbarians departed from their northern continent, Jumna, to settle in Calradia. By this time, the Calradian Empire had already reached its maximum extent, subjugating various tribes and city-states in all directions. The arrival of this new wave of Nordic migration would cause friction in the Ebor Peninsula and Cape FL for many decades. Other neighbours of the empire, who were always threatened by Calradia's military might, saw this as an opportunity to attack and weaken the emperor. Between the years 400 and 500, the Proto-Swadians living in western Calradia were beginning to organize, and many small kingdoms emerged at that time, fighting among themselves. The empire, facing issues in the Jarjara desert, hired some warlords from western Calradia to fight on its behalf against its enemies in the arid lands beyond the Jade Sea. Gradually, a group of mercenaries from the empire gained prominence, the Vlandians. They acquired land legally within the western part of the empire and assimilated the last Batanians living west of the Rhodok Hills, remnants of the Imperial conquest of Oxpool that had destroyed Lin Modris. For over 500 years, the Batanians consistently engaged in offensives, raids, and killings against both the Imperials and Vlandians. Cattle theft at night and assaults on caravans became almost everyday activities for the Batanian Fians. Throughout these years, Battania secured its dominance over the Ucalian plateau, strengthening its authority through actions considered barbaric and monstrous by the imperial aristocracy. The inconvenience caused by the Batanians to the imperial politicians and Vlandian lords was so great that the Vlandians allied with a smaller tribe of warriors called the Massa, and together launched a fierce attack against Battania through the Rhodok Hills. This attack took place around the year 950. The Batanians managed to retain control of the Rhodok Hills, but their warbands were never seen roaming western Calradia again. In the generations that followed, the Batanians experienced a mix of peace and insecurity for a brief period. To the north, their neighbours sought distant alliances, and the newly formed Principality of Sturgia was developing industries as quickly as it could. However, the weakening of the empire kept their people away from the great political game in Calradia. The civil war of the empire started in 1083 and lasted for 18 long years. Battania remained politically isolated, participating independently in the conflict according to its own interests, and passed grievances with the Imperials, Vlandians, and Sturgians, a decision that paved the kingdom's dark future. While many leaders feasted like vultures over the old imperial territories, the High King of Battania became a weak figure, and his armies no longer posed a true threat, unable to keep up with the military development of their neighbours. The military inefficiency of Battania, mainly caused by the absence of a powerful cavalry, led to disagreements among the Mormares, which were growing in discord. They found themselves exhausted from internal intrigues, and there was much despair caused by the uncertainty of the future. Between the years 1110 and 1120, 3 of the most important Batanian cities fell into enemy hands. The old Principality of Sturgia, now transformed into the Kingdom of the Vaegirs, plundered and conquered the cities of Sionon and Marunath, renaming them Livanar and Moravia. A bit further to the south, the newly formed Kingdom of Swadia captured Pencannock. The High King of Battania died during the siege, and the city was renamed Sunyo. The swift fall of 3 urban centres, including the old capital of Battania, sealed the fate of the forest people once and for all. The last High King is crowned in Dunglanis in the year 1121. Dunglanis returns to being the capital of the Batanian kingdom, as it once was many centuries ago. The last Batanian refugees, the cities of Carbanseth and Dunglanis, are overflowing with refugees, wounded and sick people. Batanian songs from this time speak of overwhelming sadness among the priests and veterans. Many young people surrender to the Wolf's Code in a futile effort to escape the famine that plagued the 2 Batanian cities. The Swadians, who had just emerged from a civil war against irredentists in their own territory, were insatiable. The city of Carbanseth is besieged and captured in the year 1150. Important temples and symbols of Batanian culture are demolished. The city burns for days until it's completely destroyed. Thousands of Batanians perish. The few survivors hide in the forests, losing faith in the safety within the walls of Dunglanis. The High King of Battania, now old and deprived of almost all of his territory, becomes a shadowy and absent figure, concealed within the ancestral wooden halls on the Rock of Glanis. A few years later, Dunglanis is besieged and quickly taken by the Swadians. They destroy most of the historic Batanian structures to build stone fortresses. The last High King is executed, and the ancient Batanian city is renamed Dirim, ending millennia of history. Throughout the next century, countless Batanian relics are lost, songs forgotten, and the language fades away completely. The ancient cities of Sionon, Pencannock, Marunath, and Dunglanis, now called Livanar, Sunyo, Moravia, and Dirim, are converted into vast granaries and lumber yards for their new owners. The forests of the Uchalian Plateau suffer relentless deforestation to make way for new villages and plantations. The last Batanians, who took to living among the trees during the Swadian and Vaegir campaigns, still haunt the roads. The skilled Fians and noble Toyseks of Battania now reduce themselves to raiders and highwaymen, returning to the wild and nomadic style of millennia past. By the year 1210, approximately a century later, the cities of Livanar and Moravia are taken from the Vaegirs and Swadians by eastern invaders, the Kurgits, who renamed them Nara and Halmar, respectively. The last signs that these were once Batanian cities slowly disappear. The wooden Batanian structures had already been demolished or destroyed by time. The few remnants of Batanian presence in the region were limited to small stone shrines in the vicinity of the cities and the walls, which had been maintained over the years. In the decades that followed, the Kurgits completed the work of the Vaegirs and Swadians in modernizing the two cities. However, they erected a new wall, new fortresses, and tore down what little remained of the Batanian structures in the city to strengthen and improve its defences. The generations of Batanians after the fall of Dunglanis and the end of the High Kingship barely remember their origins. The brutal life in the forest as bandits deprived them of the luxury of knowing their history. The tactics of the Fian and the discipline of the Toyseks are lost. For centuries, there have been no more Mormares to lead the forest people, and the ancient High Kings of Battania had their legacy coldly erased. In the year 1260, just over 100 years after the fall of Dunglanis, the descendants of the Batanian people are known in Calradia as mere wild assassins, forest thieves who are unfamiliar with ethics, practically undisciplined animals. For Calradian academics, the so-called forest bandits represented the last vestige of tribalism on the continent, the sigh of a forgotten and chastised people condemned to live among the trees, hardened by nature. Although the glorious past of the Batanians is nearly erased from collective memory, there is always the possibility that, at some point in the future, someone or some circumstance may awaken interest in this ancient culture and its lost secrets. History has a way of resurfacing when least expected, and perhaps one day the descendants of the Batanians may rediscover and reclaim their cultural heritage.